In part 1 of the history of Islam, we discussed the succession to Muhammad and the birth of the Caliphate under the leadership of Abu Bakr. The formation of the Caliphate was not an easy one, and the newly elected Caliph faced a secessionist rebellion throughout Arabia. He overcame the rebellion, but his reign lasted only for 2 years. But before Abu Bakr's death, he nominated his trusted military advisor, Umar, as a candidate for the Caliph. The Ummah and the Council of Elders were stunned because Abu Bakr and Umar could not be more different. Abu Bakr was the wise and modest grandfather type. He dressed simple and he lived simple. He accumulated no wealth and made every decision together with a council of elders. As the Caliph, he received only a very small salary. In fact, Abu Bakr continued his trading business just to get by. Sometimes he even milked the cows of the neighbors for extra cash. For all his modesty and humility, he was greatly respected. Umar, on the other hand, before his conversion to Islam, was known as a drinker and a brawler. He had a notorious temper, and he was much taller than most people around him. So the council wasn't convinced that Umar was the right person for the office. Then, in the heat of the debate, Ali stepped forward and endorsed Umar. This tipped the scale of the debate, and Umar was elected as the new Caliph. Over the next 10 years, Umar would lead the Caliphate. He would conquer the lands of Persia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt, and he would give Islamic civilization its own unique identity. Umar was a theologian as influential as Saint Paul, and he was a statesman and a patron of philosophy, much like Lorenzo de' Medici. But Umar was also a social reformer like Karl Marx, and a military thinker equal to Napoleon. Any of these achievements would have earned him a place in history, but when most people speak of Umar, all they know is that he was the second Caliph. Welcome to Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. For more information, please visit our Facebook page in the description. Towards the end of the Rida Wars, the Byzantines had moved their main army to the border of the Caliphate, and the Sassanids were trying to stir up rebellion in their former proxies, which were now part of the Caliphate. Abu Bakr believed that either a Sassanid or a Byzantine invasion of Arabia was imminent, and sent his finest general, Khalid bin al-Walid, to push back the Sassanids in Mesopotamia and the Byzantines in Syria. We discussed the Islamic conquest of Persia in a previous video. Even though he was heavily outnumbered, General al-Walid was decisively victorious in both campaigns. But during the military campaigns, Abu Bakr had died from a fever. His successor, Umar, made some military reforms and continued the campaign. Then, in the month of September in the year 634, Caliph Umar received news from General al-Walid. The siege of the Byzantine city of Damascus was over. The Caliphate was victorious. From that moment onwards, the Byzantines were on the defensive and the Muslims were on the offensive. The situation could not be more different with the Sassanids. Where the Byzantines had withdrawn, the Sassanids had continuously attempted to retake their lands in Mesopotamia. Umar argued that the only way the Sassanids would accept peace was by an utter defeat. But a crushing defeat required a full-scale invasion. The conquest of Mesopotamia and Syria could be justified as a preemptive strike or a response to a provocation. But the invasion of the Persian heartland, a foreign land with a foreign religion and foreign customs, there was nothing in the Quran that could justify such an invasion, and since it was not Islamic, the all-volunteer Muslim armies would have a hard time keeping a high morale. So Umar had to come up with something. He had to find some Islamic reasoning of why the invasion of a foreign land was just. And so he built on a principle his predecessor Abu Bakr worked on earlier during the Rida Wars. The argument was that since there was only one God, and Islam was the embodiment of God's will on earth, only one Ummah or one Muslim community could exist. And since the Ummah represented Islam and lived by the words of the Quran, the Ummah was good and peaceful. Anything outside the realm of the Ummah that did not live up to the laws of God was considered evil and chaotic. Although there is no mention of this in the Quran, early Muslim theologians and jurists and philosophers described two realms in this world. There was the Dar al-Islam, the realm of submission to God, and the realm of peace. This was the land of Muslims. Everything else was part of the Dar al-Harb. This was the realm of war. And this realm was viewed as the enemy of humankind, and therefore Muslims regarded anyone in the Dar al-Harb as infidels and were justified in declaring a jihad against them. One important thing to understand is that jihad doesn't actually mean war. It means struggle. So you can have an inner jihad to fight your bad habits and urges. But what Umar and the early Muslim scholars did was give the philosophy of jihad a military dimension to justify the invasion of a foreign land, the invasion of Persia. So, from an early Muslim point of view, the military expansions were justified as a struggle of good and justice versus evil and falsehood, like white versus black, the sun versus the moon. This was a very ancient philosophy given a legal aspect. The Caliph had created a legal Islamic way of warfare, all in the name to impose God's will on earth. The morale issue was no longer a concern. The Muslim armies viewed the jihad as a noble act. The new military dimension of a jihad, combined with some of the three finest generals in military history, the Caliphate expanded at an unprecedented rate. The field commander Khalid bin al-Walid would capture the Levant and destroy the Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk. Commander Amr ibn al-Ahaz would march on west and conquer Upper and Lower Egypt and parts of northern Africa. Commander Sa'ud ibn Abi Gawas would march east and defeat the Sassanid armies and conquer all of the Sassanid Empire, including Persia, Azerbaijan, Bactria, the Caucasus, and Makran. All in all, the Caliphate had conquered an estimated 4,000 cities during the military campaigns. Usually in war, soldiers have the permission to loot and plunder. But during the reign of Umar, the soldiers had no permission to seize the fixed properties of common citizens. The Muslim armies got the battlefield loot and 4/5 of the treasuries of the monarchs they conquered. The loot was equally divided amongst the soldiers. There was no distinction between the commander and the foot soldier. The remaining 1/5 of the loot went back to the capital Medina. That money was then distributed to the underprivileged through a social welfare system called the Bayt al-Mal. This financial institution distributed an allowance to the poor, the orphans, the widows, the disabled, and even offered child benefits and pensions for the old Muslims and non-Muslim citizens of the Caliphate. This kind of system was unheard of in ancient times, and the Rashidun Caliphate became the very first welfare state. But the crown jewel of all the conquests was the city of Jerusalem, which ranks as the third most holy site for Muslims. In fact, one of the most famous Umar stories takes place after the conquest of the city. The Caliph made his way to Jerusalem to accept the surrender of the city in person. Umar traveled with a servant, but they only had one donkey with them and thus took turns riding and walking. When they reached the city walls, the servant happened to be riding the donkey, so the people of Jerusalem mistook him for the Caliph and hastened to pay him homage and swear fealty. Eventually, the crowd was told it was the other guy they should be saluting. This kind of anecdotes are plentiful throughout the reign of Umar and attest to the Caliph's modesty and humility. But what happened next is equally important. As Umar entered Jerusalem, the Christian population assumed that the Caliph would want to perform a Muslim prayer in the city's most holy church as a token of his triumph, but Umar refused to do so. He stated that if he prayed in a church, some Muslim ruler in the future would convert that church into a mosque, and that wasn't the intention of Islam. The Caliph explained that the local people were free to live and worship as they pleased, and that from now on the Muslims would live among them, worshipping in their own way and setting an example. Umar explained that if people liked what they saw, they were welcome to join the Muslim community, but there was no compulsion in religion. This event set the pattern for the relations between Muslims and the people they conquered. The Christian and Jewish communities in Jerusalem and elsewhere throughout the Caliphate discovered that as non-Muslims they were subject to a special tax called the Yuzja, but the tax was still less than what they had been paying to the Byzantines. Furthermore, unlike the Byzantine rulers who intervened in the practices of sects in the region, the Muslim rulers viewed all the indigenous communities as either Christians or Jews. From the Muslim point of view, there was no distinction between the sects, so there was no reason to intervene in their practices, and thus the indigenous communities within the Islamic State had their own laws, had their own judges, and so enjoyed more freedoms than during the Byzantine rule. From the standpoint of the indigenous people, the Caliphate offered a mutual beneficial deal, and in fact many Christians and Jews joined forces with the Muslim armies, and this resulted in exceptionally rapid conquests. As new areas joined the Islamic State, they also benefited from free trade with other areas in the Caliphate. Prior to this, the Byzantines and the Sassanid empires imposed taxes on trade. The difference here was that the Caliphate did not tax trade itself but only wealth. So from a financial point of view, both the Caliphate and the indigenous people prospered by expanding the state. These are all minor reasons, but combined, they explain how and why the Caliphate managed to expand, integrate, and convert so rapidly throughout the Middle East. Over the next few years, it became clear that the Caliphate was now an unmatched power in the world. But in order to maintain control over these newly conquered territories, massive reforms were required. The Caliph proceeded by establishing a political structure that was inspired by the Persian administration. He centralized the government with the Caliph as the head of a sovereign political authority, and then he divided the state into provinces and appointed a governor or wali for every province. He handpicked every governor based on their skill, merits, and piety. If a governor misbehaved, the Caliph had the authority to dismiss him. The provinces were then further divided into districts, and every district or large city was governed by a junior governor or amil. Sometimes the Caliph himself would select the junior governors, and sometimes it was the provincial governor who would pick the junior governor. It is estimated that near the end of Umar's reign, there were 13 provinces and about 100 districts in the Caliphate. The provinces and even a few wealthy districts had their own standing armies, with the provincial governors acting as the commander-in-chief. One important side note is that Caliph Umar never selected anyone for a position of authority if that position was close to him or his family, no matter how talented or skillful that person was. The Caliph argued that he had to avoid the seeds of corruption by distancing himself and his family ties from the governance of the state. But aside the administrative, military, and economic reforms, the Caliph made many more religious reforms. If the first Caliph Abu Bakr had established that Islam was not just a religion, but a social political system, the second Caliph, Umar, formalized Islamic law, which would eventually lead to the creation of Sharia law. When the Caliph could not find an answer in the Quran, he would consult with the companions of Muhammad to find out what the Prophet had done or said in a similar situation. From this, Umar started a sorting process in which Muhammad's revelations and stories were checked, double-checked, and triple-checked, and then the sources were checked, double-checked, and triple-checked. Eventually, the scribes were organized into one comprehensive collection. From this practice, a new institution was established with the sole purpose to study the revelations, the stories, and examples of Muhammad. This group of scholars was called the ulama, one of the major social institutions of Islam. The scholars who touched on the subject of Islamic jurisprudence, known as fiqh, would be known as the faqih, which means jurist. From there, the jurists would use the Quran and the Sunnah as major sources for Islamic law. This was fine for a while, but sometimes a question or an issue would surface, one that was not covered by the Quran or the Sunnah, and so the jurists had to find other ways of addressing these questions. The jurists achieved a conclusion through several methods. One is the ijma, which is the consensus of the ulama scholars, and the second is through a qiyas, which is a way of legal analogous thinking. These were the most important methods for a jurist, and they were both continuously used by Caliph Umar. For example, when it turned out that the Quran or the Sunnah made no mention of punishment for adulterers, Caliph Umar and the jurists noticed that the punishment for adultery did appear in the law of Moses, which is punishment by stoning. And so, by the ijma consensus, it was agreed that the same punishment was permissible according to Islamic law. Another example is the punishment for drinking. Once again, the Quran made no mention of punishment for drinking, but Umar argued that a drunk would slander, and since the punishment for slander was the lash, through the qiyas analogy, the punishment of lashing could be applied for drinking as well. To this day, the ijma consensus and qiyas analogy is used by Islamic legal thinking. But since there are many ways of interpreting an analogy, and since consensus changes through time, there are many differences and disagreements amongst Muslims and religious institutions of what is Islamic and what is not. Another significant change that Umar, as the leading jurist, put forth was that he took measures to regulate and separate the roles of men and women. He mandated that men and women should pray separately, thus to avoid any sexual thoughts during the prayer ritual. Later Muslim rulers would form a qiyas analogy on this principle, and from there further separate the roles of women and men based on sexual tensions. This continued for centuries, and it would eventually severely restrict the role of women in the public life. This being said, it doesn't mean that in the times of early Islam, women and men were fully equals by modern standards, but education was compulsory for both boys and girls. Women worked alongside men and took an active part in the public. Women attended lectures and gave sermons. They went to war as relief workers and sometimes even fought side by side with the men. Umar himself would frequently be engaged in heated public debates as equals with women as well as men. But despite all this, Umar planted the seeds that would over the centuries restrict the participation of women in the public life within Muslim cultures. Another practice that regressed over the centuries was slavery. In the 7th century, slavery was an accepted practice, and slavery thrived throughout Arabia. Now the Quran does not ban slavery, but it does set forth restrictions. For one, a Muslim could not be a slave. The slave trade could not result in the breakups of a family, so you could only buy or sell whole families. A master could not abuse or mistreat a slave, and a slave had basic rights as the free folks had. For example, a slave had to eat at the table of the master and eat of the same foods. If these rulings had been carried to the end, slavery might have ended in the Muslim world, but it did not. Instead, over the centuries, Muslim societies regressed in this matter, and the situation of slavery increased and worsened. Umar's own life came to an end when a Sassanid Persian slave drove a knife into his stomach at a mosque. Some sources say that the slave, Piruz Nahavandi, was emotionally disturbed, and some sources say that it was a revenge conspiracy by the Sassanids for the Islamic conquest of Persia. Either way, in his deathbed, Caliph Umar made his final political ruling. He established a committee known as the Shura, whose purpose was to select a new Caliph and seek the approval of the Ummah on the candidacy. A democratic body would once again elect the next Caliph. The choice came down to two people, Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law, and Uthman, a wealthy merchant from a powerful family and the companion of Muhammad. An assembly before the public and the Shura was held. Both candidates were asked a key question. If you become Khalif, will you be guided by the Quran, the Sunnah, and the precedents set by Abu Bakr and Umar? Ali said yes to the Quran and yes to the Sunnah, but as for the decisions of Abu Bakr and Umar, Ali answered no. He had a mind of his own, and he would consult his own conscience for the decisions. Uthman, by contrast, answered, yes, I'm not an innovator. And so the Shura declared Uthman as the new Khalif, and the Ummah approved. Ali didn't believe that Uthman was the right person for the office, but unity amongst Muslims was more important than personal achievement for Ali. And so he took the oath of loyalty during that assembly. In the next part of the history of Islam, we will talk about the third Caliph, Uthman, and how he set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to the schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. For now, this was a Caspian report by me, Shirwan. If you're looking for more information, please visit our Facebook page, and if you're looking for ways to support Caspian Report, please visit our Patreon page. So for now, thank you for watching, take care, and Sahol.